in what has to be one of the most damning pieces of evidence that some people just won't learn. Socialism seems to be gaining ground in today's political landscape. You would think the fact that it's failed miserably every single time it's been attempted should be enough proof that it's an absolutely absurd ideology, but apparently not. And that is what made me record this video. While there are some very good creators out there that do a good job of discrediting socialism, it frustrates me that you rarely, if ever, see anyone bringing up some of these points. So, this is my attempt at knocking some sense into the people who still buy into this abhorrent ideology. And if nothing else, I hope it gives some of you a few arguments to use if you find yourself debating a socialist. Oh, and to be clear, before we start, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and any other Western European or Nordic country you might want to name to prove me wrong are absolutely not socialist nations. In fact, some of them have a freer economy than the United States. They are simply welfare states, which may get their own episode in the future, as this is not what we're looking into here. So let's begin with the first point. Karl Marx, certainly the most notorious proponent of socialism in history, proposed a surplus value theory based on the work of David Ricardo, creator of the labor theory of value. I will go into it in more depth, but to put it bluntly, as Sticks Hexenhammer, a good YouTube content creator, likes to say, it is economic Scientology. The labor theory of value can be summed up as the notion that what gives any good its value is the amount of work that is put into producing it. So if, let's say, a worker whose labor is valued at $15 an hour produces a handmade weave basket every 30 minutes, that basket is worth $7.50. To make things easier, and because it doesn't really change my point, we'll disregard the cost of the raw materials for the purposes of this discussion. This should be absurd on the face of it, but since I want my video to be long enough that there's at least a small chance that YouTube might recommend it, let's dive into this a bit. By the same logic, if the same worker chooses to waste 5 hours drawing vertical lines on every line on every page of a college-ruled notebook, that notebook should be now worth $75. If that same worker chooses to waste 10 hours building sand molehills on the beach at 15 minutes a mound, he will have created 40 molehills, each one valued at $3.75. Do you know one person, let alone 40, who would pay $3.75 for a small sand mound? I sure don't. That's the main problem with the labor theory of value. To put it simply, it doesn't make any sense. There are many questions you can raise here, such as who, if not the market, would even determine what the value of their workers' labor is, which brings us to my second point. Capitalism, although it certainly has its flaws, is democracy at work. Capitalism is the acknowledgement that no one person has all the answers, so we might as well allow everyone to have their input. It's clear that not everyone is highly intelligent. In fact, I think we all know there are some deeply unintelligent people out there. But the fact is, even if I were the most intelligent person in the world, and you were the dumbest, I would still not know nearly as much about your life as you. Capitalism allows you to determine how much a given product is worth to you. If you happen to think that a $200 shoe is not worth the price, then great, don't buy it. If someone else feels it's a good price, they may buy it. Even if you think that $75 is a good price for that useless notebook I mentioned in the previous point, you have every right to buy it. Not because the 5 hours of labor made it worth that amount, of course, but because it's worth that to you. Say what you will, the market is the pinnacle of democracy. Everyone has a say, and it's up to you to determine how much a product or service is worth to you. Same thing goes for labor, of course. If you have a particular skill, Employers will decide how much that skill is worth to their company, and that's how your wage is determined. Socialism is the exact opposite. The state determines what your labor is worth, what goods and services are worth, and even how many goods will be produced. Some ideologues will try to tell you that socialism is just workers' ownership over the means of production, and that workers would make those decisions. But if they truly believe that, they really need to think about this some more. First off, how would workers determine the value of their own labor and the cost of the goods they produce? They would naturally inflate those numbers for their own gain, of course. But even beyond that, as anyone who's ever worked with two or more people can tell you, if you ask 10 people to come up with the cost of any product, you will end up with 11 different answers. So, how do you make sure that things get done and that every little decision doesn't take an insane amount of time? Easy. You have a hierarchy and one person at the top who pretty much makes all the important decisions. Meaning, the only way socialism could ever work is in a dictatorship, which anyone who knows their history can tell you. It's not an accident that every socialist nation in history was run by a dictator, even if they don't call themselves that. If the state is the one who gets to decide what to produce, how much to produce, what the cost of those goods will be, what the workers will get paid, and a whole lot of other things, how would that work if there was room for debate? It wouldn't. The only thing that would allow a state like that to exist is if there is someone who will make those decisions. Otherwise, it would be a never ending debate, and nothing would ever get done. So, to sum up, capitalism is the essence of democracy, while socialism necessarily brings about totalitarianism, which leads us to point number 3. If you know your history, you will know where this is going. Virtually the same exact thing has happened every time some person or party attempted to bring about some sort of utopia. At first, it's all about the good of the people. That's why they do what they do, and that's why they need the ultimate power they demand. If any mistake is committed, say an accident in a nuclear power plant or a pandemic unleashed on the people, their first concern is to keep the truth from the public, no matter the cost of life. Because, after all, they are working for the good of the people, so anything that could jeopardize their project is a threat to the good of the people, and therefore it cannot be allowed to happen. So, the good of the people is all the justification they need to send dissenters to concentration camps, imprison journalists critical of the regime, or execute a few, maybe even a few million, defiant citizens. I say at first because they actually tend to believe that for a while. Then, as Lord Acton famously said, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. After some time has passed, and the ruler has gotten used to having this type of power, he doesn't need to justify it anymore. Like a celebrity diva or a power-hungry CEO, their subjects may not be allowed to make eye contact with them anymore. Only, in a capitalist society, if your celebrity boss is a jerk who doesn't allow you to look in their eyes, you can quit or even go to some gossip columnist and dish the dirt on them. If your CEO is a diva, you can quit. However, if your ruler is a power-hungry a-hole and you happen to make eye contact with them, that can get you killed. If he happens to wake up in a bad mood and feel like you and 20 of his subjects are engaged in a plot to have him killed, however little evidence he may have of it, that can get you and your entire family tortured and killed. And that is no thought exercise. It's happened time and time again, because that kind of unlimited power is an enormous incentive to unscrupulous people to take you out, which then naturally leads to the next point. Incentives drive human behavior. If you incentivize childbearing by offering tax breaks to couples that have children, you instantly see the fertility rate of the population rise. If you incentivize your employees to work harder by offering healthy bonuses or more time off, you will see their productivity rise. The bigger the incentive, the more effective it is. That's the reason why so many people will work prohibitive hours in multinational companies. They want to climb the corporate ladder. The promise that they can be an executive and earn millions or dozens of millions every year is all the motivation they need to pretty much dedicate their lives to work, and in many cases, to play extremely dirty politics and throw their colleagues under the bus. Now imagine instead of earning 7, 8, or even 9 figures a year, you had the chance to become pretty much the owner of an entire nation. Imagine the laws would no longer apply to you. No one could stop you from doing whatever it is you want to do. And the national treasury would become your own personal piggy bank. What do you think some people would do to achieve that kind of power and wealth? It's true that several of the people who achieve positions of power within the corporate world are terrible people, who threw so many of their colleagues under the bus they would make comic book villains blush. But not all of them are like that. Just as many, if not more, are simply extremely competent people who were so valuable to their company they just kept climbing the ranks. And even those who are terrible people, who would cheat and steal to make a profit, who would allow people to die in order to gain a new lucrative contract, are still bound by law. Say what you want of them, they can't murder people who work for them in plain sight and just get on with their day. As much as some people like to pretend like executives are the bane of our existence, they are not the all-powerful villains these people make them out to be. There are many former CEOs or owners of large companies in prison today, or who were in prison up until recently, serving very long sentences. Some of the most notorious ones include Bernie Madoff, Jeff Skilling, Bernie Evers, Dennis Kozlowski, Walter Forbes, and Sanjay Kumar. Dictators, on the other hand, do not go to prison, even if they order the murder of millions of people. Pol Pot, the socialist despot who ordered the killing of up to 30% of his country's population, did not break a single law. Not because he found some loophole where he could get people killed if he had the order laundered through an offshore company, but simply because he wasn't subject to the laws of Cambodia at the time. As the dictator, whatever he decided to do was just fine. When Stalin or Mao Zedong had dozens of millions of people killed, the reason they didn't go to prison isn't because they bribed the right people, or because they were good at covering their tracks and providing reasonable doubt of their guilt. It's because, as dictators, they could do whatever they wanted. Now think about the type of people that would be attracted to this position, where you can lie, cheat, steal, and kill all you want and never suffer any consequences. Then think about what they would do to achieve that position. Because as much as psychopaths may want to kill enough people to actually alter the population density of an entire nation, that's not all they get out of it. It's no accident that in Venezuela, a nation in which the minimum wage is $2 a month, where 75% of its citizens lost an average of 19 pounds due to food shortage, where 82% of the households find themselves below the poverty line, and where 93% of the population claim their income isn't enough to cover their food needs, the richest person is called Maria Gabriela Chavez. If that name sounds familiar to you, it's not a coincidence. She just happens to be the daughter of the former dictator Hugo Chavez, and her net worth is estimated at $4.2 billion. In Cuba, where the average wage is about $22 a month, Fidel Castro was worth, in 2006, or 10 years before his death, an estimated $900 million. And that leads to my fifth and final point. This is where all the previous points combine to form one last self-evident argument. Socialism hurts the poor. Here's how. Economically, it doesn't make sense. It's based on ideology instead of actual evidence and logical thinking, And when put into practice, the economy becomes so inefficient it can't produce enough to sustain the populace. Being a totalitarian society, the poor can't do anything to change it. They either don't vote at all, or their vote is just for show. A dictator or the party is and will always be in charge of the decision making. That's where human nature comes in. And even if they had noble intentions to begin with, they would almost certainly be corrupted by that absolute power. And even in the one in a multi-gazillion chance they aren't, there will always be some unscrupulous psychopath ready to kill the dictator and take over, so he can make himself and his family and friends rich and murder everyone who gets in his way. Then, with all the power of the state behind him, he can use that to make sure he and his friends are the only ones who will benefit from it. They take ownership or control of the largest corporations of the country, and they don't allow anyone to compete with them. The money is then concentrated in the hands of the party members or the oligarchs who happen to be friends with the ruler, and since there are no companies to compete with them, they get to pay whatever they want to their workers. That's how you get an average wage of $22 a month. Since their main goal is to maintain their wealth and power, they will embezzle money from every sector, from energy to healthcare. It goes without saying that their houses will always be very well illuminated, and that they won't have to worry about the country's terrible healthcare because they can afford to travel to the US to visit whatever doctors they like. The poor, however, are left to deal with those terrible services. And if they dare to say anything bad about the party or the ruler, they risk being tortured, thrown in jail, or just disappearing altogether in an attempt to scare the others into blind obedience. In conclusion, I would never say capitalism is without fault. Of course, it has its problems. Everything has problems. There's corruption, scarcity, and suffering. But those things are not a product of capitalism. They are a product of human nature and the consequences of life, at least until we can achieve a point where scarcity will no longer be a thing. Corruption in a capitalist system is mitigated by limiting everyone's power. We understand corruption will be around, at least for the foreseeable future. We try to make its impact more tolerable by limiting the damage the corrupt can do. Socialist nations, on the other hand, following an illogical ideology, just ignore the problem, which exacerbates it. By giving too much power to the ruler and the other members of the party, you make corruption much more damaging than it needs to be. Scarcity is still a feature of life on Earth. Capitalism deals with it by attempting to employ a meritocratic system. If you work harder or happen to be more intelligent than the average, you get better rewards. It may seem cruel, but this reward system is responsible for making the lives of the entire human race infinitely better over the last century. People are incentivized to do things that make other people's lives better, because they make more money that way. Socialists try to pretend like scarcity isn't a thing, and promise everything to everyone. That's not reality. In reality, millions of people starve, and the rest barely hang on, while a minuscule minority of the party members get unreasonably rich and fat. Suffering is a feature of life. Whatever the political system, it will always be around. Capitalists acknowledge the reality and try to mitigate its harshness. Socialists pretend the world is all rainbows and ponies, and make everything a million times worse. Just like a disease, ignoring these realities won't help you. In fact, it'll ruin everything.